This session is on intergenerational worship, and why it's worth it. So obviously you can tell from the title that I think it's worth it. I think it's a good thing to do. I think it's where we should be. It's not always what we're encouraged to do these days from a lot of different places, but I think it's worth it. How did I get interested in this whole intergenerational worship subject? Is a question to start off with. I've been just interested in intergenerational worship really all of my music ministry, and I've been fortunate to serve in churches where that was valued and prized. And I know from my own experience what worshiping with people and living in community with people from different generations is all about. And I think for those of us who've been around for a bit of time, you can decide whatever that means, but when we've been around a bit of time, we've lived to experience different times in our own lives, and the fact that we needed other people during those different times. We needed people that had been already down that path, or maybe we need some people who are just starting on that path, and the way that that can nurture our relationship in our lives is different and is important. Last summer, I decided I do a monthly blog posting for Creator Magazine on their Monday morning. It used to be the Monday morning email, but now it's an everyday email thing. And I decided to write a post on desegregating worship. And I did that last August because it was the 50th anniversary of the civil rights legislation, and actually started out to write it about racial segregation in worship, and that Martin Luther King had said, I think in 1968, that Sunday morning is the most segregated hour of the week in America. And asking the question, is that still true? Well, then I got to thinking about how many other ways are we segregating worship. And I wrote one on age segregation, I wrote one on gender segregation, I wrote 6 or 7 of them. Can't remember how many of them I wrote, but a bunch of different things about ways that worship is segregated within our culture. And it occurs to me that oftentimes we actually think that's a good thing, and we defend that, and we duplicate that process in a lot of ways. So I just want us to take some time today to explore this, and hopefully what I'd like for us to do is then come up with some practical ways. I suggest some things, but I'm sure there are a lot of others in the room, a lot of others that you brought with you, things that are successful with you, or maybe some questions, because I know that it's a challenge these days in many of our contexts. And I've dealt with those challenges in the local church, and I know how some people are working to make those things change. So anyway, enough said about that. Why should we have this conversation? Many churches are segregated into age group worship gatherings. Some churches have children's worship, youth worship, in Waco, college worship, and then some churches are very much geared toward young adults. There are some churches who are gearing toward older adults, though that doesn't seem to be a very popular thing to do, which is a bit offensive actually. But there you go. So we have lots of churches that are segregated intentionally in lots of ways. I've asked the question often that if we have children's worship and youth worship, which is quite common, college worship, then why are we asking then where are our young adults? Because they no longer have worship that is for the 24-year-old worshipers or the 23-year-olds or whatever that next segregated kind of model is. So we've really trained them to only worship within like-minded cohorts. And then we wonder, why are they gone, and why do they not value what the church is offering today when the church is not specifically about them? Within cities, churches often cater to an age group and are seen as niche churches. Now, I don't know if that's true in your city, but I think it's true in ours. That some churches are seen like that's kind of the college church, and the college church in Waco kind of grazes around to different places. You know, it shifts every few years, as some of us have been around a bit. But there are other churches that really seem to cater towards specific age groups. And we must know that. And it's important, as in lots of cases in ministry, it's really important that we know how we are perceived, the church that we are in, and what others are saying about us. In truth, most of the truth about us is about what other people perceive about us. We're often the least objective people about ourselves. And the longer we stay in a congregation, it's my experience, the less objective we are about the congregation that we serve in. It's very hard to be objective about the congregation that you love. And really, ultimately, the congregation that kind of reflects you. Because when you're a leader there for a long time, it does kind of start to look a bit like you. So, important stuff. Within some congregations, there are multiple age groups many congregations that function independently in terms of spiritual nurture and formation. And I've often said about churches that do multiple worship services, some of you have heard me say this, that really that's not altogether a bad thing. It just means that you have a church within a church. You really do have multiple congregations that share the same facilities and cooperate budget-wise. And you will have different worshiping communities. Now, where it hits harder is when you have families that are attending these different worship services, and you even lose the cohesion within a family unit. That one family likes one and one another, and the grandparents go to this service and whatever. And we all say we go to the same church. Well, maybe we really don't. We meet in the same building, you might say. By those who want to grow numerically, niche worship is often viewed positively. And there are churches everywhere that will tell you the way to grow is to be a very niche kind of congregation, reach out to young people, reach out to this group of people, this age group, this socioeconomic group, or whatever. That was also one of the segregating places, was socioeconomic segregation, which is prominent in our towns, and I don't know about yours, but it is in ours. But what is it like to worship with people who don't have the money that you have, or have far more than you do? And both of those can be painful, differently painful, at different stages. So how did we get here? I don't know, and I don't have a perfect answer to this, but some things that I think. One is an obsession with me and mine. It wouldn't have occurred to some worshipers a few generations ago to be so defensive about what we do in the church and whether it pleases me or not. That would not have really occurred to worshipers at a different time frame. We've been through the so-called worship wars, where it was really about what I like, what I don't like, and we've seen that people in our generation know about all those things. But the whole my worship and my needs has fed into this lack of intergenerational worship. Segregation is rampant in our culture. We've just alluded to that. Gender segregation, race, age, even sexual preferences and gender identity and all these kinds of things. All of this kind of segregation stuff is everywhere in our culture. And it's ironic that it's so present when we say we're at a time when it is so not present. Okay, that's where the irony really hits me. Because when I started thinking about this, I would say, we live in such an open, inclusive culture. We are so accepting these days and all this kind of stuff. And I think a lot of people are, but the segregation is still very, very present. Okay. Marketing targets specific age groups. And it makes us think about products even as being very age specific. How many of you have watched television during the daytime lately? Anybody watch occasional television in the daytime? What kind of advertisements do you see mostly if you watch daytime television? Who is targeted?
Middle-aged women.
Okay, women.
People out of work.
Okay, women, women with children, and older people. So you'll see lots, and I won't name the products, but things that you might associate with people of advanced age, me perhaps, but someone of a bit advanced age, or something specifically to somebody who might be at home during the day. You see the same kinds of things happen in the evenings, and depending on what programs you're watching, all of the advertising is very, very specific to the target audience of who would be watching those programs. So this marketing stuff is a very big deal. If you're a member of AARP, and I'm sure that a lot of you are, as am I get this couple magazines every month. And it's interesting to see what is being targeted toward the people over 50 versus a magazine for our kids, if I flip through something like that. So marketing targets specific age groups. And it makes us think in terms of, we're not like them. We are not like they. They are very different than we. It feeds that general kind of sense. Yeah. Living arrangements, retirement homes, and gated communities. I've known people that moved into gated communities and retirement homes, and they've said, one of the best things about our community is we don't have children in this community. There's no children are not allowed, and I'm sure grandkids or something, but basically you're not putting up with the problems of kids, the challenges of kids, problems, whatever. All right. I don't know about some other communities, but I know there's some around Baylor that certainly I wouldn't want to be around because they're too youthful for me, and maybe too differently. A different kind of thing. But those kinds of communities, do you realize that for some of us to think 30 or 40 years ago, we wouldn't have thought of these very segregated kinds of living places? And that feeds this idea that I don't have a lot in common with these other people. And so I'm different, therefore, whatever the culture is doing also always feeds the church. It impacts the church in some way or other. Perceived educational benefits. Learn best with others who share our needs. Okay, I'm an educator, and I would teach, I'll teach a class this year about music education in the church and how we're educating within congregations. And I would say that what we teach needs to be age-specific within music, and it needs to be appropriate for skill levels and all of that. So that's true. I would believe that that's true. But that's not the only truth. There are also truths that we need to grow into. And there are many things that we learn from older people or people at a different stage in our life that we may not understand completely right now, but we may have a sense of it. For instance, a child may go to a prayer meeting, and the prayers may be very theological, and the child, in my case, going to prayer meetings as a child, I didn't often understand a lot of what was going on, and I was pretty bored out of my mind. This is like prayer before revivals in the country kind of stuff. But I sensed that something really important was going on there. I had this deep sense that this was bigger than my little world, and that something really holy was happening. So a lot of times with intergenerational stuff, it's not that we get it all, or not that we are ready for it all, but we are learning something, we're taking more in. How would you pose that on the other side? Say you're the older person participating with your people the age of maybe your grandkids, if your grandkids may be teenagers or something. How would you imagine that, how would you learn from them, and how does your world become enhanced through interacting with people younger than you?
Email and texting.
Sometimes you need help with those things, don't you? Yeah, you can, practically you get help, but how is our life enhanced by that?
Creativity.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah.
Perspective. One of the benefits of maturing, regardless of your age, is ideally the ability to see something from someone else's perspective.
Absolutely. Very, very good. I have the privilege of working around college students most of the time, and I believe that gives me a perspective that might not be the same as some other people who aren't around younger people a lot. And it helps me believe very positively about young people, actually. And I can believe most days that the world is quite good, because most of the kids students, young people that I work with, are about really great things. And I get to have that, I get to be inspired by them. And honestly, I believe most days I'm more inspired by them than they likely are by me. I believe that I'm the recipient most days of that good. Most of the important things I've learned in the last few years have been through my students. And what they write about and all that stuff has inspired me greatly. So that works in the church too. It really does. It really does impact us. Affluence and choice. We have been able to afford choices. Has it occurred to you that the option of having worship that isn't inclusive of all generations is because of our affluence? It's because we can afford all these different kinds of things. Some of your churches have very elaborate facilities for different age groups, and we are able to afford those kinds of experiences. When you go to some very poor places in our world, people worship together and babies are passed from one person to another. If the baby cries, somebody else tries their hand at pacifying the baby. That's the world I grew up in, actually, in a very rural, small church. It's not altogether a bad thing. There's some very positive things about that. Some of you have heard me say this before, but a number of years ago, a wise person, a person quite a bit older than I, said, I used to complain about babies crying in worship and about all the noise and distractions of children. And he said, but we don't have any children now in our congregation. And I long to hear a baby cry in worship. Often thought of that, and I've been the advocate of encouraging parents to bring their children to worship, even if they weren't at their best, and encouraging them to sit close to the front, because they will be way more engaged up front than they will be in the balcony where they feel like onlookers. But allowing that, and then the congregation being willing to affirm those differences. But Affluence gives us choices. So that's part of our challenge. Specialization. We have hired others to do that for which we are unskilled. How does that carry to the church, and how does this whole specialization kind of thing carry into the lack of multi-generational worship or intergenerational worship?
If you take the points that you've given up to this point, that we divide for specific reasons, and you have the affluence, then if your church decides you need a ministry to 7th grade trombone players, then you hire someone who can minister to 7th grade trombone players. And you can further segregate in the name of reaching out to a very specific subset.
Yeah, we have a very artsy group of kids in our congregation, so we want to reach these kids, or these parents but want this for their kids, therefore we get somebody who can do that and specialize in that way.
And I think on that note,
Yeah.
it also means that we continue to just go with people who are professional ministers, and we take away ministry from lay people.
Yeah. Some of us, Cheryl and I were talking during the break about the importance of ministry within a context, and saying, now, who are the people in my congregation, this congregation, who are these people, how do we take their talents, and what do we make that's really, really wonderful within this local space? And how do we, I won't call anybody's names, this is being recorded, but how do we work with the organist in our church who might not be the finest? How do we bring her along to be better? And then how do we be a minister enough to compensate for that person's weaknesses? And bring in other people that can help that person to be successful. That's where ministry really happens so often. It's not always, in a food model, it's not always about deciding, well, I'm going to cook dinner. Now, what will I cook? And let me make a shopping list. Another option is to say, I'm going to cook dinner. What is already in the pantry? Now, how can I be creative with what is there? Now, in my opinion, ministry is not about the shopping list, but it's about what is in the pantry. Real creativity comes from saying, here's what is, now what can I do with that, and how can I make something really great out of what is? And really, you'll find great personal satisfaction, actually, in using the gifts that are among you. Yeah. And people will know the difference, too. Yeah, absolutely.
How does that speak to this whole idea of contextualization and what you were saying? Within the body of a church, and the people in the pew and worshiping to the people that are there, seems to me that what we do in worship really hasn't changed. We pray, we praise, we preach, we practice communion, and baptism. But how we do it has changed, and as a matter of context, when I'm in the jungles of Nicaragua, worship is much different for me than it is in Truett Hall. So speak to, how you reconcile that. I mean, to give voice, to give song, to give music to the ideas, the expressions of the worshipers in a certain context, sometimes creates what you're describing, generational or divided, segregated worship.
Well, that's a very hard question, John, as you would know. I think first it starts with knowing the people in the congregation. And oftentimes we don't really know people and know their stories. So we don't really know who can do what. From a musical perspective, I've used this example with my students, that the community that I grew up in, I know the people my age and 5, 6 years older and a bit younger. And I remind them, sometimes I say, you know, the first grade teacher at the elementary school in the town I grew up in was a 4-year all-state flute player. Yeah. Now, I don't imagine, now people know her, she's taught there 30 years now as the first grade teacher, but people don't know her as the all-state flute player, who's one of the finest innate musicians I've ever worked with in my whole life. People don't know that about her, probably. I mean, and I don't know that she plays much anymore. She's also a fine singer, she studied, but she's the first grade teacher. You could pull together, at our family reunion a week from Saturday, you could pull together a pretty amazing instrumental ensemble from all my cousins that played in the band. Because they were all really good. Yeah. But no one would know that unless you asked some questions. And you wouldn't know that, you know, these people they were good enough to pull it out and do it again, you know? That kind of thing. So you have to start with knowing people. And then sometimes that does segregate things, but then we have to work for this whole idea that I love this song, I appreciate this, not because it's my favorite, but because it is your favorite. And I love you enough. A wonderful mentor minister of mine once said, you can love people into anything. And I do believe that leadership is primarily about love. I like to think of leadership and love as being very code-connected or connected, that when people know you love them, it's amazing what can happen. I had dinner last week with a family in our church that I have never interacted with much, other than just some very informal kind of conversations after church. But this person asked me, the man of the family, he said, why is it that we do an organ postlude every week? He said, I just really wanted to ask you that. And, you know, to me it's really loud, and why is it always loud? And I'm ready to talk and visit with my neighbors, and it's very, kind of messes up my conversation time. So we spent a few minutes, and I said, well, it's history. You know, we've done that historically. It's really an extension of the benediction. It's a way that we send people forth, and we send them forth with great energy and positivity, and we're sending, you know, and we're launching you and blessing you through that music. And we talked a little bit about that, and he said, you know, I'm going to listen really differently after that. And then his wife said, you know, well, I'd really miss it if it weren't there. My gosh, we always do that. I'd really, really miss it. Well, Sunday, this very same person, we've never had a musical conversation ever. He came to me before I went to work with the choir, and he said, have you had a good morning with music? And so you got everything together? Is it all coming together okay this morning? Now, that was the result of a conversation, because he had a glimpse into the world that I'm living in, and so his engagement with worship shifted from just a conversation. So I'm going to nurture that some more, you know, and it just said to me, you know, Randall, you should be doing more of this. You need to be having more of these conversations. And I actually might have believed that this person was not so very supportive, you know, if you had asked me, rather than thinking we had this conversation. So that's the kind of thing that reminds me over and over and over not to put labels on people, but to listen to them. Yeah. Freedom to abdicate responsibilities. That's kind of related to the specialization. But we have the freedom to actually make those choices and to give others responsibilities for things that we don't want to do. Yeah. Retirement as an expected life cycle. People are not always expected to retire. That's a fairly new kind of thing. This whole 62 retirement or 65, or people my age are saying, not going to happen, you know. I don't think I'll ever get to that space. But that's not always been an expected thing. But it's given us a very designated group of people, and it's marked ages. Social Security kind of did that. You know, what's magical about 65? You know, why would 65 be magical? Well, you know, Social Security says, so we all kind of go with that. unless you're my age, and we're in the quite a bit later Social Security group.
When that age was set, life expectancy was much lower.
That's right.
And now we're paying the price financially because we're living much longer
Yeah.
and retiring at 65.
Yeah. But if you ask a group of students today about retirement, they'll say, I just don't think I would ever do that. Their whole perspective on that is really, really different. And they're looking at life a lot differently in terms of, and I have, people are also beginning to say, not use the retirement word, not use the R word, but say, some kind of reimagining or regearing or, something along those lines.
What would have been your thought when you were their age? What was your thought? Did you even consider it?
I have always been the retirement oriented guy.
Okay.
And that's partly, I would say that, just personally, that's partly because I grew up in a very poor family and around people that didn't have very much. And so I am a first generation college student, and I grew up sort of like a depression person, about 30 years younger, and I grew up very conscious of those kinds of things. But now that I am, 10, 15 years away from that time, I really don't imagine that happening, but it would be a choice, I would think. There's a lot of things I still want to be a part of. Some students still think that way, but not so much. Yeah, what would have been I think the way I might have felt about 22 years old, 22 or 23, most of my students are feeling that same sense of I got to get on with life about 30. Or really very seriously about 30, 32, well, I should kind of be thinking about, big boy stuff, And, some of us were thinking that a lot sooner. It's not altogether bad, there's some really good things about that. Some of us lived in some pressure we might shouldn't have imposed on ourselves or on others. I don't know. Institutional daycare and elder care. You say, well, what in the world does that have to do with the church? Well, some of you older people, who were the people, if you had two working parents, who were the people that cared for you when you were little?
Grandparents.
My grandparents, I never knew a babysitter other than a grandparent. And pretty much everybody I knew stayed with an aunt or a grandparent or, somebody like that. So it's all this familial stuff, and it wasn't an institutional thing. And certainly not taking care of your elders would really have been kind of a taboo thing in another generation, a few generations ago. Now, do you realize I'm not necessarily critiquing those things? I have older parents, and I understand all these things, and I'm in the middle of those kind of things. Yet I'm just saying it does affect the church. It has an effect on the church. The graded everything movement. We've had the graded choir movement and the graded everything. We've alluded to that already. It's good, but where does it stop? What are the limits of it? And what is appropriate age segregation for learning and appropriate integration? Where do we bring those together? Obsession with youth culture, youth camps, youth music. There's a new book which I give you the information for. It's called The Juvenilization of American Christianity. And I'm only about a third of the way through the book, and I've ordered a book, and then it came in another book as a little bookmark, and then it did the right thing, because then I ordered the book that was on the bookmark, because it sounded really more interesting in the book that I ordered. But it's an intriguing book, and it really evaluates the whole youth culture thing, and the fact that we are all caught up in youth culture, that we all want to be young, and we go to all kinds of levels, and how it's affected the church.
I see that when generations discuss, and I say that very politely, the differences in their preferences of music, is that older generations prefer the music of their youth. Style aside, that's what they prefer. In very few instances have I seen generations that understand that about the younger generations. They don't want to allow, they wouldn't say it that way, but they don't want to allow the younger generation to have their music that they grow with and mature with. It's
Yeah.
very interesting.
It is. And most of us get stuck somewhere along the way, or we maybe stuck is overstated, but we have strong preferences that develop at some stage. Some believe that those preferences are probably somewhere between 25 and 30 into early 30s, and you have a really good experience with worship or a church or with music or something, and then that really sort of shapes who you are and how you imagine. This sort of sets the bar, kind of sets the standard for what's really good. You'll find that often when you talk to people. I think sometimes that as musicians, I would like to believe that we don't get stuck as much as other people because we're continually rediscovering. But I would say, from a personal perspective, that you have to be dogged about the rediscovering. Okay. You really have to you have to keep giving yourself the same medicine that you've given to others. And saying, don't get stuck on this just because you think this is not the whole truth. Other people think differently than you. You need to value this, try it out, see how it feels. You have to keep on taking that medicine over and over. Some of the songs that we're going to be doing in worship this week are not, they're very varied. There's a couple of them that are. There's one that we're doing on Thursday, I think the end of the session, that's kind of out there. And I really debated, this is true confession, I really debated on whether asking one of the students to lead it, because it's youthful, it's younger, but I decided, no, I'm not that old, I can do this, and hey, we ought not say, just because this is a song typically sung by younger congregations or whatever, I'm not going to participate in that, because actually it has a great text, it's a good song, it's meaningful, and it has really grown on me and become meaningful. So, it's a song called You're Beautiful. You're Beautiful, that song, yeah. Anyway, just to say, let's keep on jumping into new things. We won't grow unless we do that. And that comes back to what we're going to say here in a minute, is setting an example about being an intergenerational person. Everyone wants to be young. Back to the obsession with youth culture. Everybody wants to be young, and everybody thinks that young is just the coolest thing of all. We all want to, whatever looking young means, surgeries, all kinds of things. We want to do whatever it takes to be young. The ones of us who've been around a while, being young is not everything it is cracked up to be. It has its problems. Every stage has its problems. Every stage has its challenges. But it also engenders the whole fact that nobody wants to grow up. These days, really, we have a culture where nobody really wants to be the adult. And that's a hard thing to say, but oftentimes that's the case. It's hard to be the adult sometimes in our current culture. What are the implications of this stuff that we've talked about? The church is adept at action but short on reflection. And again, that's a pretty harsh statement. But the church often says, absolutely, let's go this direction, let's do this, let's do that. That worked in Fort Worth, we'll try in Waco, or whatever the case. We're not always good at saying, where would this lead? And in this whole intergenerational thing, we've said, draws a lot of kids, draws a lot of teenagers, but is it forming a lot of people? And how is it forming people for the long haul? And really, we have to, as adults and leaders and parents and our goal is to challenge people for the long haul. Our goal is to invest in the things that matter for the long haul. No longer a church for your needs. You graduate out of church. So we have this system where you can actually graduate out of church because now we don't have a church for you because it's not specific enough. And we've set up this pattern. Smaller communities can sometimes be perceived as not relevant, because there are too many needs and too few resources for being specialized. How many of you are from a town of fewer than 5,000 or fewer? Okay, several of you. It's hard to be a church in that kind of community many times because people say, well, they have this in Little Rock, or they have this in whatever in the town. It's also hard to be the small church in a larger community. I tell my students sometimes that for years, we do these do the best we could at Christmas, and somebody would always come up and say, "Oh, but did you hear that Christmas program over at Columbus Avenue last week?" You know, or whatever, you know, some other big church, and they would say, you know, "Did you, oh, that was really it," you know. And it's like, I've never, you know, they perceive I've never been out of town, you know. I wouldn't know the difference. And so sometimes it's hard to be that. And then with the specialization, it puts churches in a tough place sometimes, especially small churches that can't be everything. You can't have all this specialization. It builds a lack of broad-based faith, faith to grow into. It sometimes is lacking the hard stuff, and it's lacking the stories of when life doesn't go so well and when life catches up to us, all of those kinds of things. Failure to pass along the stories of other generations. We don't pass along those stories because we don't know them. We don't know the story. We don't know. It's sort of like life begins and ends with today. It started today, it ends with today, and we have no breadth of anything else. Sometimes it's hard with kids. I mean, with a person, we have a teenage son and a young adult daughter, and you know they don't always want to hear all these things that you're believing would be helpful to pass along to them. Yeah. But it's interesting, as they get a little older, you realize they've listened a lot more than you thought they would. Yeah. So be encouraged. Spiritual theological amnesia. Starts and ends with the moment. Yeah, we don't remember. We don't have a memory. I've written a book called From Memory to Imagination, and I don't just talk about the imagination part. I say that part of the challenge of the church is that we don't remember. We don't have a memory, therefore we can't really create much of a future. A memory gives us a basis, see. A memory gives us something to act on. It gives us a place to launch. It gives us a place from which to be creative. As a musician, your memory is incredibly important because what you remember is what you bring behind this podium as a conductor. If you don't remember it, it is invaluable to you. It is not valuable to you, right? Because you can't use it. Yeah, if Robert isn't making the sound that I need him to make, if I don't remember how to help them, I'm of no value. You see, so memory is incredible, and memory helps us. And memory is what launches us, and it launches the church, and it launches us personally in so many ways. Shortage of empathy and understanding. I think that goes along with a lack of knowledge. We don't understand because we haven't heard the story and we don't know. Lost generations. We have lost generations who didn't find their way back. Sometimes people find their way back and sometimes they don't. And we can't be responsible for all of that. And I don't want you to hear what I'm saying today, that somehow you need to go out of here with everybody on your shoulder that left your church and hasn't returned. That's not the case at all. But on the other hand, if we don't think about those people, we don't think about how many young people in our congregation in the last few years went away to college and somehow didn't keep their faith intact. Their faith didn't continue to progress. And see, I think about that every time I think about the youth ministry at our church. I'm burdened by those kids who've left and forsook their faith, gave it up. And I'm thinking, we've got to do better. We've got to plant something better in them so that we don't have this happen again, as best we can control. Everyone misses out on the broader view of the gospel when we don't work intergenerationally. What about the Bible? What does the Bible have to say? And I quoted some scriptures and then gave you some other verses to look at. The first one, we are all, takes many to form one body. Each member belongs to all the others. I like the idea there of each member belongs to all the others, that we are not an island and we are interdependent. The pattern of worship, young men and maidens, old men and children, let them praise the name of the Lord. And then on the next page, your sons and daughters will prophesy, your old men will dream dreams. But I like the idea that I will pour out my spirit, and that it takes all of us, and no one is excluded in these verses. And then the last one I cite, the last part of that verse especially, we will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord. It is important that we share those. And then there's many, many verses you can look up here. So, why advocate for intergenerational worship? We'll move through this a bit quicker. Theologically and biblically, what does the Bible say? You've seen some of the things above, and that's just a drop in the bucket of what the Bible says. What is the larger framework of God's overall plan for God's people? And I would say it's to be interconnected. It really is about a community of faith that is broad and rich and diverse. I don't think we would find anything theological to support something else. What are your personal and congregational goals for your children, teenagers, young adults, median adults, older adults regarding faith development? How do we reach them? How do the generations foster these goals? And so I think just like I was talking about the youth in our congregation and children, how do we want these children to be formed? What do we want to happen? How do we believe that older adults should be formed? How do we believe that older adults should be continuing to live their life? What does the Bible say about that? What does it say about involvement? What does it say about reflecting? How do we integrate these people? And what does that mean in our congregation? So we have to think about that. We need each other, and I said even if we don't always want each other. Okay, sometimes it's not the thing we choose, but it is really good and it is important. Our children have spent considerable time in the summers with their grandparents. And there were stages in their life where they really looked forward to going to their grandparents. And I'm sorry to say, there are stages where they didn't want to go, and I said, yes, you are going. And you'll be fine when you get there, and there's nothing that will harm you, and you'll learn a lot. Okay. And it was kind of the medicine that they took. I know for grandparents that just would be horrible, wouldn't it, you know? But if you've ever had kids, you know, you might be smart enough to know at some point in your life that your grandkids might come and visit and they were forced, you know, or strongly encouraged, you know, something like that. But it is good for them to have that. So what has happened, though, is in some tougher times in our kids' lives, who are some of the first people that our kids have called? They call their grandparents. And it pleases me greatly when I know that our kids have had a rough day and they've taken their phone and called their grandparents. And I can only imagine how pleased that would make the grandparent. But there's been a number of times lately, and that's because that relationship was nurtured. Sometimes not out of the greatest joy. But if we only nurture relationships out of great joy, how much would you have missed in your life? You wouldn't have been a musician and you probably wouldn't be here, because you can't all say that all of music was joyful. That would be totally lying. Yeah, it's a lot of hard work mostly, isn't it? And then you get to enjoy it. It's a ton of hard work. So life is like that. Our culture's lack of preparation for the next stage. And I think sometimes that our lack of preparing for people for what's going to be really difficult is one of the reasons that we have such high levels of depression and substance abuse and that kind of thing. That somehow we're not telling people, without being negative, this is kind of what it's going to be like in this next stage. And it's going to be really difficult. This college stage, this junior high stage, whatever this stage is. But not making people dreadful, but also letting them be aware. And I think that happens with middle age too, right? There's so many people I know. Somebody just the other day was telling me, I think my husband's having a midlife crisis and he's going crazy and all this kind of stuff. You know, I don't think that anybody said, you know, about 50 you're going to feel really, really rough here for a while. And it's going to be, might be kind of tough, and you might really doubt yourself a lot. And for the ones of us that is, who have we told that? You know, it's likely to be kind of tough. Yeah. We're not always good about passing along the knowledge and something to other people and help. So that's one of the things that we like.
One thing we're struggling or have struggled with, we're dear, precious choir members with Alzheimer's, or my pianist for my senior adult choir. How do you graciously and lovingly know when is the time? And so that's just been it's a very hard struggle to do the ministry thing.
Yeah, a quick story about that. I served as the interim at Columbus Avenue years ago, And there was a man in the choir who had very serious Alzheimer's. And on a typical Wednesday night, I would answer the same set of questions from him 4 times. Every time I saw him, it was complete start over. And I would, I would get to the point where I would look around the corner because I only had so much time to get these things done, and I just kind of have to run the other way. But there was a woman in the choir who cared for him and brought him to choir every week, and I realized if I ever moved him, he would get angry, and it would kind of be a showdown. And so I had to be careful, but the choir in that church loved him and cared for him and treated him tenderly right to the end. And shortly after I left, within just a very short time, he passed away. But they held right on with him, just right to the end. And the very last time we did a program of something, he just couldn't get it, But he stood there. And he stood there and he gave his effort, and he'd been a brilliant guy, and he had, in his sanest moments, he had great stories about all these things he had done, and they were true. It was wonderful, but it really showed a different level of ministry. And if we can help each other to realize, I may be him, I very well may be him, and how am I paying it forward? And what am I doing about this? There's a woman in our congregation that every week during Lent, told me, I really want us to sing, not because he lives on high. Yeah. And she told me that every single week. And every single week I would say, I promise you we're going to get to this. Give me about 3 or 4 more weeks, give me about 5 weeks, give me whatever. As soon as we get to Easter, we're going to sing this song. And sure enough, we did. We blew it out and sang the whole thing with the big high ending and the whole bit, and really, really did. She's gone to the nursing home just a few weeks back, but she has some deficiencies. But there again, she consumed my after-church Sunday time, with long discussions. Hey, that may be me one day. Maybe you, and that's what ministry is for. Now, I could talk to a lot of people that might be politically more advantageous for me to have a conversation with, but hey, what difference does it make? Yeah. Good point. What are some practical steps we can take? Keep the challenge in front of others. Be the advocate for this. I think you have to keep advocating, and slowly you change a culture over a long period of time, and you have to keep it coming. Set an example yourself. How do we do that? We become the friend to children, the friend to older people. I've had a student one time who said, well, I just don't do older people. And I'm like, not the right answer. We don't choose in ministry. We love people, absolutely. People in my children's music ministry class have said, I just don't really work well with children. I said, well, learn to. Hey, not an excuse, We're about people. So set an example of being an intergenerational person. Facilitate intergenerational discussion and dialogue. Find ways to do that, to create some conversation. You can be the person who suggests Sunday school classes combining for the summer. We've started at our church recently an intergenerational class. And we have a woman in there who's way up close to 90, and we have some college students who said, I really want an intergenerational experience.
Wow.
And so it's been really good, and it's grown to be the largest class in our church because people have really liked not being with just people their age. So find some ways to create those experiences. We'll talk about worship here in a second, but know who you are within a generational model. Understanding how others view us is a good step toward modeling intergenerational ministry. So how are you perceived? Who are you? Sometimes it's really good to look in the mirror and say, now, based on what I'm seeing, how might others view me? not based on, most of us, some studies show that most of us imagine ourselves 11 years younger than we are. That fits about the way I think of myself. Yeah. But it's not true when you look, okay? Yeah. So knowing who you are and knowing that at this stage I am, for my students, I am certainly the age of their fathers. I would be borderline for some kids, almost a grandparent age, because our kids are a bit late. But knowing that and knowing that I can't be a big brother and I shouldn't try to be that to them anymore, because I'm a different stage in my life. I have to be that person now, or I will appear quite ridiculous. And we've all known those people, that tried not to be who they are, and that doesn't help us. So knowing who you are is a great step to reaching out intergenerationally. Make intergenerational plans for your own life. Who are you going to be at different stages? And how are you going to be connected to others? I think one of the greatest fears I would have about not teaching is that I wouldn't have younger friends still. But there are ways to build that relationship, those relationships, and how might we build that, and how might we, but thinking about ourselves in different generations is important. Model intergenerational worship, enlist a balanced group of worship leaders, even things like people who take up the offering. We do a really good job in our church of having a very varied group of ages, and lots of people can take up the offering. They can't be maybe as well included in other things. Reading scripture, prayer leading, people who sing. So many times we put all young people up in front to lead singing. This week we're doing that because we're using students. But I wouldn't do that in a church. I would want there to be some gray-haired people and some pudgy people and some not so pudgy people maybe, and not just having the pretty people up all the time, and really modeling that. But notice things like children's messages. When's the last time you've used an 80-year-old retired teacher to present a children's message in worship? But why not? You think that person doesn't know how to talk to children now? Do they lose that somehow? Do we forget those things? I don't think so. So modeling that. But consider all chapters of life's journey to be equally valuable. Let's don't put a high priority of which ones are the most valuable. Avoid age stereotypes. What are they? There are lots of them. Yeah, we usually know them better at certain times. Worship planning should be age inclusive, so try to include everybody even in the planning. Could be another subject. Encourage activities that prepare worshipers to interact with other age groups before the service. So not just so it's only in worship, but what about some churches have coffee times and all those things? When is the last time you had a child being a greeter?
Every Sunday.
Okay, that's great. But if you're going to reach out to families, wouldn't it be nice for a family to see a child, a younger person being a greeter rather than just older males in a lot of our churches? Yeah. Think about those things. And they're not always easy to change, I promise you. They're not. But to create awareness is important. Make sure that each age group has a respected part in the leadership. Okay. Program intergenerational exchange in your own congregational music groups, life groups, Sunday school groupings. We talked about that some. Use your influence positively and ask the question, what is your influence? Most of the time you have more influence than you know. Most of us. Find ways to tell the intergenerational story. Testimonies in worship are a very good way to do that. If you want to use a lot of testimonies, it's best to have people write them, and then you know the content. If you can control the length. If you have screens and stuff in your church, then you can actually control the length by videoing them and then cutting them, which is even a nicer way to do it. Lots of things. Set up a system for assisting parents with young children. That's a place where oftentimes parents have their children in worship. They bring their children to worship with them, but they're very frustrated. They don't know how to take care of their children in public. They don't know what's acceptable, and they feel very as if they're being just observed. And so find some ways to assist parents and help parents, and even bring along some other people to help sometimes. Especially if there are children in your church that don't come with parents. Unaccompanied children should always have somebody that they trust in the congregation that's their surrogate parent. Consider a system preparing younger families with older families. It'd be a really good thing. I've been thinking about that a lot in our church. How could we find mentoring families, How could we do that? I think that would be a great gift. We're fortunate to have some older folks in our congregation who are that to us unofficially. And we're really, really depending on them to help us with some stuff. What are some hopeful signs for the future? Younger people are eager to develop friendships with older adults. The young people I work with are eager to do that. They're ready to do that, and they want to do that. So recognize that. So what does that say about you and me who are not so young? Are those younger people going to say, Cheryl, I'd really like to become friends with you, and I'd like to, invite you to lunch sometime? A teenager's not likely to do that.
No.
But what if Cheryl were to say, I want to invest in your life? Could we, you see, the difference in that, yeah. And doing that in tasteful ways so that we're not, seen as predators and all those other things that become issues for us. But they're tasteful, right ways to do that. There really are right ways to do that. And we have to know what those are. Yeah.
We've had just a couple of couples I can think of that are looking for a new church in our city because they're going to a church where everyone is their age. And they've visited our church, and my wife and I went to lunch with one family, and they're like, we want to be, we've been going to this Sunday school class that y'all are in, but everyone's our age. And one of the reasons we are coming to your church is because we want to go to Sunday school with people generations older than us. And so our church is having to take a step back and say, okay, what are we going to create for that? Because we didn't start that. It's coming to us. People are looking for that.
Yeah.
And it's just
I
happening.
believe you're right. Really believe that's right. And I think it's okay to market that. It's okay to, let people know. Not tell the story. Tell the truth, okay? Just tell the truth. Some grandparents are moving to live closer to family. That's a good sign in some ways of intergenerational stuff. Older people are living longer and avoiding intentional isolation. Many older people these days are really wanting engaging opportunities. And we need to encourage that and assist that. Retirement is shifting as a cultural norm, socially, economically, and other kinds of ways. Many people are not retiring, and that is keeping people much more active and seen as active a lot longer. Some people are seeing the benefits of staying in the middle of a normal life instead of opting for isolated communities. And I'm not just being so critical of isolated communities, but I have some people that I know that I worked with who retired 25 years ago and moved to an isolated retirement community in another state, and I would think they would have gotten tired of that. It just seems that to me. Yeah. Especially since they were so full of other people's lives, it would just seem odd to me. Yeah, an intergenerational choir model. I'm just going to share quickly. We have an intergenerational choir in our church that has 7th grade through people well into their 70s. I don't know that we have anybody in their 80s because we don't have a lot of older people in our congregation, which I have told our staff is not a strength of our church right now. We need more older people. But one of the reasons we've done that is that we have stretched leadership. A lot of people in our church, we have some pretty good people who are pretty good musicians, and they don't want to just be not good. They don't want to sing in a group that can't do this pretty well. But we only have so much leadership. But more than that, we only have such a little amount of time that we can seem to squeeze in rehearsal. And so that's one of our reasons. Another, more ensembles and meetings, and parents and children are overly committed. I used to be so critical of parents that have overcommitted children, but if your kid's in 2 or 3 things, it's uncontrollable almost, and you don't push your kids to do these things, but they just have more than they honestly should be doing sometimes, and you still want them to do something in church. The size of the choir in our church needed everybody, and I said we really need all hands on deck here for a bit, and we have some good youth kids, and we started working with that. The expectations of everyone involved was high, and so we put together this intergenerational choir. And it's been I would say quite a good success. I wouldn't say it's just been, blowing the top off of anything, but we will have 12 high school kids, junior high school, 12, 14 maybe, and then and on the best days, we might have 45, 50 people total. So it's a good percentage. It's around a third of the choir. And honestly, they've been helpful. These high school kids have been immensely helpful. Very good. And so I'm always reaching out.
Choir, or is this?
It has become the choir.
Okay.
Yeah. And we tried the youth choir thing a bit, and again, just the time and leadership. If you do youth choir well, like some of you all do, you have to really invest in it. I mean, you cannot do it half-hearted. It is, nothing in the church could be half-hearted these days and be successful. It just can't. But you don't just show up for the youth and expect them to come. It's got to be quite. You don't have to take them on every amazing trip in the world, but you gotta be challenged. You gotta do some good music stuff. All right. Yeah. Questions and comments. I went longer than I intended and didn't leave as much time for questions, and I apologize for that. I didn't pace that as well as I wish I had.
What do you do with the perception about memory? I mean, our church is 157 years old, but there are some people who think, will say, well, it would be just nice to start a new church because then we can start fresh without the perception of what happened in the past. And especially for First Baptist churches. So in that way, I think culture sometimes perceives memory as a bad thing. So how do you think about change, or how can you confront that cultural expectation on some people?
I think sometimes we have to redefine memory. And it's been, as kind of studying this whole memory thing and working on the book, I've really become quite the advocate for nurturing memory and realizing that most good that comes in our life is somehow, memory launches it somehow or other. Even creativity. The most creative people that I know tend to be the people with the best memory. Because if you've done a choir banquet 50 times, well, you've got 50 options to choose from. That kind of thing, see. And so sometimes we think, well, you do something over and over and over, that's not very creative. But you've got all this memory. I believe that I am able to choose better music now at 54 than I could at 22, because I have conducted thousands of anthems through the years. I mean, not hundreds, but I tell you how much stuff I've conducted. And so every time when I'm making choices, I'm like, oh, this would be good, and I'm really having to choose because I know a lot of stuff. Plus, I want to do new things too. You see how memory becomes part of the creative atmosphere? Yeah. And we don't nurture that. We don't say those things, that so memory doesn't have to be something that locks you into sameness. It can actually be the avenue from which you can launch into freedom. All right, yes?
I just have one thing that I think is kind of interesting to think about as far as this is concerned is, as you've kind of been talking, one thing that's really kind of hit me over the head is your use of the word community and how important that is. I'm kind of struck with this idea of, everything that we've been talking about has been in terms of American culture. And so, intergenerationally, thinking about it kind of this way, I've gotten the opportunity to do some studies in ethnomusicology, and so I'm kind of thinking about it this way. And one thing that is kind of interesting to me is, in some places of the world that I've been, they're doing intergenerational worship natively, and so I think there's a really cool opportunity to learn from churches in other parts of the world that are already doing this.
Absolutely.
So as we're kind of learning from generations above us and below us, I think we can also learn from churches beside us.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and all progress is not progress.
Mm-hmm.
I think in this area and so many other areas, relationship affects perception greatly. And I know over the years with my youth choir, when we've gone on trips, I have a thing I do called quality time with directions. And I make sure that every youth spends 30 minutes with me, and we talk about what's going on in their lives, their plans for the future, they ask me questions. And invariably, sometime I'll say something, oh, I'm too old to do that. Oh, you're not old, Brother Paul. How old are you? Oh, I'm 60. Oh, you're not 60. you know, and these are teenagers who don't think I'm as old as I really am, but it's because we know each other.
That's right, yeah. You've grown up together in a sense. And growing up together doesn't just mean somebody else grows. Yeah. All right, thank you all so much. So it's youth choir concert in 10 minutes in the other building. Thank you. Oh, thank you.